Immunization. In the COSHH hierarchy of control measures, immunization, as protection against infection at work, is the last line of defense, and other controls should be available. However, for workers potentially exposed to bloodborne viruses such as piercers, tattooists, and beauty therapists, immunization is an appropriate additional measure. In simple terms, this approach uses the following principles, and in the following order of consideration, under COSHH requirements. If a risk assessment shows that there is a risk of exposure to biological agents, and effective vaccines exist, then provision should be made to determine whether an employee is already immunized, and immunization should be offered to those not already immunized. The pros and cons of immunization and non-immunization should be explained when offering immunization to the worker at risk. Under the Health and Safety at Work etc. Act, employers must pay for protective measures such as immunization. Where practical, this is likely to be provided through the company occupational health provider. Alternatively, the employee could be asked to arrange immunization through their own GP, but the employer must make alternative arrangements, if this cannot be done, and reimburse any charges made to the employee for such arrangements. As with all control measures, immunization needs to be checked and reviewed and boosters provided where deemed necessary by you and or your employer. Employer responsibilities. The risks from exposure to BBV must be assessed under COSHH regulations, and appropriate measures to protect workers and others from infection risks must be implemented. The provision of routine pre-exposure immunization may be appropriate in certain cases, e.g. in exposure-prone occupations for those not already immune. Employers need to be able to demonstrate that an effective employee immunization program is in place, and they have an obligation to arrange and pay for this service. It is acknowledged that some exposure-prone workers may choose not to have the immunization. Health and safety law requires that employees shall not be charged for vaccines offered as means of protecting them at work. In providing vaccines, employers should ensure that employees are made aware of the advantages and disadvantages of immunization and its limitations. If you are a self-employed contractor, then this responsibility falls with yourself. Occupational health records should be kept updated of any immunization courses undertaken. Employees are at liberty to refuse immunization, but any refusal should be considered as part of the risk assessment. Additional controls may still be necessary, particularly since immunization is currently only effective against HBV, and should therefore be considered as part of the risk assessment of work assigned to the individual. Any exposure-prone work should only be undertaken when all work activities and their potential for bloodborne virus exposure have been assessed in this way, and the necessary controls are in place. Under the COSHH regulations, individual workers have the right to know whether or not they have been protected by immunization, and their employers need to know if the vaccine has been effective after it has been administered. Consideration is required of how information on immunization is communicated to managers, while maintaining medical confidentiality for the individual. Immunization, vaccination, is available against HBV, but not other BBVs. The need for a worker to be immunized should be determined by the risk assessment. It should only be seen as a supplement to reinforce other control measures. If an employer, you should make vaccines available free of charge to employees, if they are needed. It is recommended that a vaccination record is kept. Further information on immunization can be found in publications by the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens and UK Health Departments. Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens, government.uk, www.gov.uk. Hepatitis B, HBV, vaccination. The Department of Health has identified the following occupational groups to be at an increased risk of exposure to bloodborne viruses and recommends that they be immunized against HBV. Laboratory staff handling biological material that may be contaminated with BBV. Staff of residential and other accommodation for those with learning difficulties. Those handling cadavers and other human remains, such as anatomical pathology technologists, APTs, funeral directors, embalmers and pathologists. Prison service staff in regular contact with inmates. Certain members of the emergency frontline services, such as the police, ambulance and fire and rescue services, may require vaccination, but only if local risk assessment indicates a need, and only if occupational health advice supports this requirement. As body art professionals, we do not specifically fall into one of these categories, but being vaccinated against any potential risks is strongly advised.